Do you believe there are errors in the Bible today? Really important question. As we move forward over the last bunch of years, I was reading actually a study this week that talked about the reason people abandon Christianity, the reason they stop believing in Christianity. And it's been over the last 100 years or so that it used to be that people stopped believing in Christianity because of creation issues or other questions. And now, one of the major reasons that people leave Christianity among millennials is this question right here. They believe that the Bible is filled with errors. So, no, I don't believe there are errors in the Bible. I think there are different translations of the Bible. Of course, when you're taking something from the original language, so the Bible is written in Hebrew and then the New Testament in Greek. And what you have is sometimes you have to bring over certain words and you have to nuance them and try to figure out how can you translate a concept over to a modern language. And sometimes in that there might be a translation breakdown or something, but I don't think there are errors. I think, for instance, in the Greek, when you read Romans chapter 3, Paul talks about the idea that the cross of Christ is a propitiation for your sins. Now, depending on which translation you read, you might read the NIV, for instance, and the NIV will say that the cross of Christ is a sacrifice of atonement. But then you read the NASB or the ESV, which we preach from here, and it retains the word propitiation. And the reason for that is because propitiation meant two things. It meant the sacrifice of atonement, but it also meant absorbing the wrath of God. So the NIV says, well, how do we tell them what it means? So they tell them what it means, but the problem is it only captures half of what it means because sacrifice of atonement's half it, but the other half is that that the cross of Christ absorbs the wrath of God onto himself and pays for sin. So in that sense, there's not errors, there's just nuance that might be lost in one translation or another. Classically, the things that people have raised that have said there are errors in the Bible, and then the list of examples people give, most of them have been shown to be false. So I'll give you a couple examples. In Matthew's gospel, the gospel that we're studying, by the time we get to the resurrection narrative, there are two angels at the tomb. But if you read Mark's gospel, there is one angel that speaks. And so skeptics have come along and said, look, Matthew says there are two angels. Mark says there are one angel. There is errors in the Bible. Let's throw it out and let's not trust it. But mathematically, here's what we got to understand, and I know this will blow your mind. Where there is two, there is one. So what Mark is doing is he's simply saying one spoke and honing in on the one that's speaking. Mark doesn't say in his resurrection story, there was only one, there was not two. He simply says there was one and he spoke this way and he said this. Matthew tells us there was two. So was there one or two? There was two, but Mark hones in on the one. Another example is people say, well, look, this account of Judas' death say that he hung himself. The other account of Judas' death says that his guts spilled out all over a field. Look, the Bible's wrong. It gives two contrary accounts of the death of Judas. Let's throw out our Bibles and not believe it anymore. Problem with that is those aren't contradictions. Judas hung himself, yes. He hung there for a while. And then as time went on, his body expanded, the rope broke, he fell down on some rocks, and his body exploded, and his guts went all over the place, and that's why they named this field this. Those aren't contradictions. They're simply different angles in on the same story. Here's what we've got to understand. When we read the Bible, do not come at the scriptures with an anachronistic mindset, meaning that we're 21st century Canadian modern Christians and we do documentaries a particular way. We write people's biographies in a particular way. But we can't take that construct and project it back on the Bible and say, the Bible has to be exactly what I think the Bible should be. So the Gospels are a particular genre of literature, and they're writing Jesus' story not as a biography. So if you read John, there's no birth narrative. If you read Mark, there's no birth narrative. Only Luke and Matthew give us a birth narrative. Because in the first century, the genre of gospel didn't necessitate someone takes someone's birth and explains everything chronologically. It had the freedom to take information and actually arrange it according to a theological purpose. And so when we're reading Matthew has the freedom to take information Jesus said at the end of his ministry and bring it into the beginning. I'll give you a classic example of this. In the Synoptic Gospels, which are Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus walks into Jerusalem at the end of his ministry, and he goes into the temple. Remember the story? And he doesn't like what's happening in the temple, and so he makes a whip, which is just crazy. As an aside, he made a whip. He didn't take one out that had already there. He didn't grab some. He sat down for a while and made one, and then started whipping animals and tables, and he gets all angry. That's at the end of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. But in John's gospel, it happens in John chapter 2, right at the beginning of his ministry. So scholars say, well, what happened? Was it at the end? Was it at the beginning? Or did he do it twice? I don't think he did it twice. I think if he did it once, that would have been enough for the Jews and the Roman Empire to get on him and focus on him and kill him quickly. I think John has the freedom to take something that happened at the end of Jesus' life and bring it into the beginning, because John is trying to do a particular theological thing. He's just come from the wedding of Cana, and he said, look at these jars of purification. I'm superseding this, and I'm bringing the new wine. The next story is he goes into the temple, and he says, I'm superseding this temple with, I'm the new temple. And so John goes, oh, I want to take this story and bring it into the marriage ceremony, because they're making the same point. That's the freedom that they actually had. We don't have, I'm reading a biography right now on Walt Disney. A modern biography does not have the freedom to take something that happened at the end of Disney's life and bring it into it doesn't say, Walt Disney built Disney World when he was 4 years old, all right? We'd be like, what? That doesn't make any sense. Because a modern biography has to be strictly chronological. That's not the way the first century worked. It's not the way the Old Testament worked. So don't bring your modern framework and put it onto the Bible and say, oh, look. And there's lots of examples. You can read a book by Norm Geisler that goes through almost every example of anything anybody's ever raised and said, look at this. The Bible has errors in it. It contradicts itself. And he goes through and explains them all. Sometimes it's a number that contradicts another number. First Chronicles says there was this many people. Numbers says it's because they're rounding up. They have the freedom to leave the children out or whatever. These aren't massive contradictions. They're just different angles on the same story. All right, like us watching a car crash. One person saw it was a blue car. It's different angles of the same story, but it's true, and there aren't mistakes in the text.